Hey everybody. So for today's video, I will talk about how film has changed since the early 1900s all the way to the 1970s. And then I'll make an additional video after this one that's going to talk about how film has changed since the 80s, since the 80s is a very distinct period of films. Um, so for this first half of the video, in some ways, um, so I'm going to talk about the very early years of film, and all the way up to the 70s, since that's another very distinct era of films too, and kind of how film has just changed since that time period. This video was also asked by request. That's another reason why I want to do this video. Um, but for my first half, like I said, I really just want to focus on the early age of cinema all the way to the 70s and how it's different from then to now, how cinema is different compared to those eras. Um, so the obvious tone that film has taken ever since those eras is, I think films have taken a much darker tone since then. Films just seem a lot darker now than they used to be. I think if you went back in the cinema, like let's say the 30s, 40s, and 50s, you'd see like Singing in the Rain and something along the lines of I Love Lucy and Leave It to Beaver. And I know those were TV shows, but films were kind of like that in the same spirit too, I think. So much darker tone films. Another good example is like even look at the old Adam West Batman show compared to the Batman films by Christopher Nolan. I mean, though that's a huge leap from tone and how the Batman stories were told and everything. So I think it's just really interesting how films have just gotten much darker over the years. Another thing I've noticed, and a lot of people would probably agree with me, is I think sex scenes in films have gotten much more in depth. Like you get to see more of what's going on. In the past, if there was any form of sex scene or making love scene at all, um, what they would do is you might see like a door close or the light shutting off right before the people take off their clothes and stuff. So over the years, we've seen unfortunately more of that. Um, I think it's because people, want to see that, and I guess the directors of today think that it's important that we see what's going on and stuff. So, good and bad thing, I guess. It's good because we actually get to see what's going on, but bad because, well, do we really want the kids of America to see that kind of stuff on TV and on movies and stuff? Um, Films have seemed to have brutaler violence since I'd say the 70s too. Um, I mean, almost every film you go to nowadays, whether it's a horror film, an action film, any film that has punching, kicking, people fighting for their lives, kind of a thing. It just seems a much brutaler form of violence compared to films that were made back in the day. A good example is look at the film The Green Berets by John Wayne, and then look at a film like Platoon or even some other ones that weren't even made in 2012, um, like Black Hawk Down and all that stuff. I mean, war films alone have you could really get to see everything that happened from the war. Like they really depict what the war was like in today's cinema. Back in the day, it was like G and PG, and it was pretty ridiculous. Um, I'd also say more films have more profanity now, and a huge example of this is if you watch the Judd Apatow film Knocked Up. Uh, that film alone is probably every swear word in the book is in that movie. Um, and a lot of films back in the day simply just didn't do it. I mean, they were aware back in the day that films weren't rated and that people of all ages would have gone to whatever movie at whatever time. And so I guess that's why profanity has gotten more out of hand, is simply because of the rating system. If we have the R rating next to it, it's perfectly okay to add as much swear words as we want. And if the PG-13 ratings next to a movie, they can have some language, but not so much that it's R, and so on and so forth. And back in the day, there was no rating system. It was just, let's try to make it appropriate as we can and hope that whatever audience we can get is what we can make money off of. Also, it seems like kid films have more complex material than they did back in the day. I mean, if you look at a film like, I don't know, like Sword in the Stone or The Jungle Book, or I'm thinking of there's some really old cartoon movies, animated films. Um, Even look at like the old Steamboat Willie, or that was the first Mickey Mouse cartoon on shot on film kind of a thing. Um, Look at that compared to like Up or Brave or trying to think of some other Pixar ones, like like The Incredibles and all that stuff. Um, it just seems like it's more complex now than it was back then. Um, I think back in the day, people were worried. Well, if kids don't get the idea of an old man having these memories of this woman and having these experiences of what the relationship was like and how it built over time and everything. If kids don't get it, let's not do it, kind of a thing. Back in the day, it was very simple-minded stuff that made it into the animated films. Um, so kid films, I would say, it has much more complex material than it did back in the day. Um, the fact that animation is mostly done on computer now, and back in the day when Walt Disney was alive, it was all hand drawn. It was all painted in cell by cell, and now it's all done on computer. I mean, it's very rare nowadays to find films that are purely drawn by hand. It's very non-existent at this point. Um, Tons of CGI in today's film world. I mean, every film that's an action movie, a sci-fi movie, films that have creatures and things that would be too hard to get people in costume to do. All CGI now, all CGI. Back in the day, it was all costume stuff, and that's why we didn't get to see a lot of monster movies and all that stuff. And when they did exist, it was all costumes and robotics and things that we could actually do back in the day. So tons of CGI now. I don't know if anybody else recognizes this either, but the style and the art form of acting seems different than it did back in the day. Watch a film like The Sting, and then you go to a film like Inception. Both are heist films. Just a very different tone of acting if you really think about it. Um, I mean, just look at like old black and white films and then watch a today film, and I think in today's world of films they try to game for a more, like the way I'm talking to you right now, kind of a realistic voice. And back in the day, it was very distinct and very Marlon Brando-ish, and very Jimmy Stewart-ish, and all that stuff. Um, so I think just the overall style and the art form of acting has changed too. Um, People's expectations seem much higher in films now than they did back then. Look at The Dark Knight Rises. I mean, people have been looking forward to that film for 4 years now. Um, and it just has such a huge high expectation because they're aware of what Hollywood can do, and they're aware of what special effects and what things we can realistically get onto film without too much CGI, and how complex the story will be, how it will wrap up a trilogy. All those things go into people's expectations when they go into that movie. And I think back in the day, where people were like, well, if it has a decent script and some good acting and maybe one good realistic looking monster, I'll like the movie, kind of a thing. Um, so people's expectations, I think, have really changed over the years. Um, Cruder humor in films too. Look at a film like Some Like It Hot, and then you watch a film like by Judd Apatow nowadays. Very different tone of humor. I think in today's world of humor, it's okay to show things like penises, and people seem to think it's okay to actually show poop and pee and people puking and all that stuff. Didn't exist back then. I mean, wasn't even a thought back in the day. Um, so I think humor has changed, and I guess for me this is kind of a bad thing, simply because people rely on those easy humor jokes in order to make their film good. I think back in the day they really had to think what was funny and what was not funny in order to make a comedy work. Um, and I think just different kinds of humor. I mean, back in the day they had to make a universal form of humor in order for the film to do well all over the world. And I think with today's world, because film has uh, stretched and become such a flexible way of telling stories. I mean, people see different kinds of humor like all over the place now in all different kinds of films. And my last point I want to make is there's a lot more blood and gore in films than there was back in the day. I mean, horror films always had some form of blood in it, maybe even some forms of gore too. But it's very extreme now. I mean, you watch a film like look at John Carpenter's Halloween from the 70's, and then watch Rob Zombie's Halloween. huge difference. I mean, Rob Zombie's Halloween has a bunch of blood and gore, a lot of language, a lot of nudity, a lot of sex scenes. It's just very, very extreme compared to how it was back in the day. Um, so film has very much changed since the 1900s and the 70's. Um, so come back for my next video. I'm going to talk about how film has changed since the 80's, since the 80's was also a very distinct era of film. And I hope you enjoyed this video. And if there's any other comments or views on how film has changed over years, feel free to leave a comment. And hopefully I'll see you guys next time.